Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining our public lecture, which is a joint initiative between the Irish Gerontological Society and the Health Service Executive. What we are trying to achieve in this lectures is to raise issues and discuss issues that really affect the health and well-being of older people, but beyond what we usually perceive as health and social care. So address the wider determinants of health and well-being in older people. And to this today, I'm delighted to introduce you to a colleague of mine, Dr. Colm Byrne, who's a geriatrician working in the matter, who is an active member of the Irish Doctors for the Environment and also a co-chair of their active travel committee. He completed his doctorate on the effects of air pollution and stroke incidence in Ireland through the RCSI. So thank you very much. I will hand you over to Dr. Byrne, and afterwards we will have a panel discussion, and I will introduce the panel then. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. So thank you very much and enjoy the lecture.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne. So, and thank you very much to the IGS for giving me the opportunity to speak today on this topic. And I think older people and the effects of climate change can often be forgotten about and sidelined, and it's great to get the opportunity to talk about it today. So firstly, to set the scene, what is happening to our climate and what has happened over the last century or so. So since 1900, as I think everyone will be aware who's listening in, the climate of the Earth has gotten warmer, and I think we can all see the changes in our climate, even through our lives, that we can see that the weather is getting more extreme and so on. But I think the most important thing to contextualize at the start is that we're here in and around the mark there at 2020. That's where we are at the minute. But that the decisions that we make today will determine how we age in the future. So it'll determine the climate that we age into. So if you're born in 2020, the decisions that are made today in terms of how we address climate change will affect how you age when it gets to 2090 and you're 70 years old. But similarly, if you're 70-year-old, retiring now, say 65, 70 years old, I think everyone hopes that they'll live for another 30 years. By 30 years' time, we're going to have passed 2050 when we're meant to have hit net zero. And the decisions, the changes that we make today to reduce emissions will affect, and you can see the different scenarios there, from very high, where we continue our current and runaway carbon emissions, where it's going to just get hotter and hotter and hotter, to the very low, where we would have to take quite extreme measures now, but that it will ensure that we don't get much warmer than it is now. And I suppose that's the decision that we need to make now as a society. How much more warming are we going to be able to put up with, and how that will affect us as we get older into this century. So just to kind of reiterate as well, this planet is continuing to get warmer. We are continuing to put out emissions, and it is relentless. We are at the warmest point we've ever been since thousands of years. At this point, the Earth has never been warmer, and we can see the effects in increased storms. Only just this week in Dubai, there was a flash flooding incident that was associated with climate change, or more likely because of climate change. But there has been a recent mega drought in Madagascar that was directly linked with climate change, and this is going to continue. And climate breakdown is already the story of this century. We know how many storms and so on that have happened over the last few years, but it will continue to be the main event in our lives. This is how this is what we're going to have to be dealing with for the rest of our lives as we all get older, and no matter what age we are at the minute, we are all going to have to continue to be dealing with the effects of climate change as we go on. And this is going to lead to more and more extreme events. And sorry that this doesn't project very well, but basically the top graph, this is from the latest IPCC climate change report, and the top graph is meant to show the globe. And basically, if we want to bring it local to Northwest Europe, we are going to get more heat, more precipitation, but also more drought, because there's going to be more extremes of weather where the rainfall patterns are going to change. So we're going to have more flooding events, but also that there's going to be longer spells where there is drought as well. And we are going to have to be able to deal with that as we get older. And this isn't taking into account what I think scares a lot of people who have looked at climate change in any way, are things like the Gulf Stream or the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the Gulf Stream shutting down. If something like that happens, that could completely change our climate, and the kind of Goldilocks zone that we live in now would change to something more akin to northern Canada, and could end things like agriculture in Ireland forever. And on that, food impacts are going to be huge. Fishery yields are going to reduce, even at the level of warming that we have today. Fishery yields have reduced across the world, but that will get worse if we continue to emit the amounts that we currently are. And similarly with things like maize and other foodstuffs, just parts of the world are going to be unable to grow these things into the future. And then, in addition, the risk of heat humidity. So when we talk about human survivability, when it comes to heat, there's this idea, it's the wet bulb temperature, which takes into account humidity, and there's parts of the world now where regularly for 100 days or more of the year, it reaches levels where it is unsafe to be outside, and the human body can't cope with that, and that's only going to get worse and worse as we depending on what level of emissions that we put out now, that is only going to get worse and worse. And so, as I said at the start, we are making the decisions now as to what how we're going to age, but also what parts of the globe that we're going to be able to live in, and huge parts across the equator. If we continue on the route that we are at the minute, where we would be up at that 4.2 to 5.4 end, huge parts of the globe, including India, Indonesia, and parts of Africa and South America, are going to be inhospitable. We're just not going to be able to live there as humans, and that's going to have huge global impacts. And the extreme weather events are going to become more common as well. And so events that previously would have happened every, say, 10 years are going to be more likely to happen. And similarly for events that happen every 50 years. And these include, as I said earlier, droughts, hot temperatures, and heavy precipitation. And again, if we continue on this route, we're going to see these events at a much higher rate, something like 30, 40 times more likely to happen if we continue on our current course. And why is this important for older people? Well, older people are more vulnerable to the effects of things like storms and flooding and so on. 75% of those who died in Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans and in that area were over 60 years old, yet they only accounted for 16% of the local population. There's a higher mortality in older people due to drowning, hypothermia, and heart attacks and other diseases. Flooding also affects local health services and leads to postponement of routine and non-urgent treatments, which has lasting impacts on population health. And then there's also the increased risk of waterborne diseases when storms and flooding occur. Then the other thing to consider is that older people might be less likely to get flood and storm warnings as well, and then maybe less able to respond, so less able to get up and move or be able to get out of somewhere, and could lead to being trapped in their houses. So evacuation policies need to specifically address older people, and that includes access to housing, heating, and food and water. And similarly, the 2018 Lancet report on climate change examined the vulnerability of people in Europe over 65 to heat waves, and estimated that 42% of people over the age of 65 are vulnerable to heat waves. There's a lot of different reasons, but the vulnerability occurs due to altered thirst sensation, acute kidney injury, but also increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And again, I apologize for the quality here, but this is a quote from a report called "Climate Change in an Aging World" by HelpAge, and this is a quote from a gentleman in Somalia who's a refugee in Kenya, and he says that for the last 3 years, the drought was the worst I have ever seen. I heard of people dying in the area, and I made a decision. We had remained in Somalia, my family would have died. Since the journey, I have had many problems. I can barely stand or walk without my walking stick, and I also have headaches and pain in my abdomen. That's Ali from Somalia, now living in Kenya, and this is going to be a common story that older people are going to be telling as we progress through the century, due to the effects of heat waves and droughts and food shortages and so on. And I suppose just touch on what, fundamentally, why does this happen? And I suppose we're all, this kind of comes to the core of what geriatrics is, and it's about frailty and the frail in older person. And if you have less of a functional reserve, that you are more prone to stressor events. And I think classically in geriatrics, we would think of those things as, things like your, infections, constipation, things like that. But a flooding event, a heat wave, living without food is a stressor event as well, and that could be for a short period of time. Could only be a couple of days, maybe of a food shortage, or being in in heat and so on. But that could tip them over into a dependent state, and could have lasting, lifelong impacts on an older person. So it is something that I think, as geriatricians, we need to bear that in mind, that climate change and the effects of it are stressor events and can have lasting impacts, just like other diseases that we've been more used to looking at. So then, how are we doing? How are we doing at addressing this issue as a world and as a country? Well, this is the country overshoot days. This is from 2022, but it hasn't changed too much, to be honest, in 2024. We are in a couple of days' time, on April 21st. So this weekend, we are going to hit Ireland's country overshoot day, where if everyone on Earth lived like us, the Earth would run out of resources on this day. We overuse resources in Ireland. Probably it would take 3 Earths essentially to sustain the world if everyone lived like us in Ireland. And it's an important thing to bear in mind in terms of, as a society, how we need to address climate change, and how we need to address our use of resources on this planet, which is a finite resource. And we need to very, very quickly start slashing emissions if we are to have any chance of reaching 1.5 degrees of warming. And we need to do it now. We really need to start doing it now and doing it very, very, very quickly. As you can see from this, any delay rapidly increases the amount of emissions that we have to cut on the way to 2050, and unfortunately peak emissions are still going up globally, so we are going to have to rapidly decrease our emissions. Probably the target of 2050 for net zero probably isn't going to keep us below 1.5 now. We need to get that by 2040. So we really, really quickly need to start addressing our carbon emissions and reducing them. And how we're doing in Ireland? Well, not much better. We are not meeting our carbon budget. We are not following the line down that we're meant to be doing. We are making some improvements, but nothing near what we need to be doing to meet our own carbon goals. And unfortunately, if it was only climate change, things would be easier. But we have a lot of other things that are coming over the horizon. We have crises with air pollution. We have biodiversity loss, which is probably as big, which is as big an issue as climate change. We have an inactivity epidemic that needs to be dealt with as well as a society. Access to clean, safe drinking water is a huge issue, and even in Ireland, there's huge levels of nitrates and so on in our rivers and in our lakes. Antibiotic resistance, land degradation, and food security are also other issues that we need to deal with as society alongside climate change. And this is why Kate Raworth, an economist in the UK, has come up with the idea of donut economics to try and conceptualize what we need to do. So we have these ecological ceilings, like I mentioned, where climate change, ozone layer depletion, air pollution, biodiversity loss, and so on, that we need to stay within. Otherwise, things that our society isn't sustainable. But we do also have requirements from a social foundation point of view, like food, water, health, education, peace and justice, and so on, that we also need to address and to address the shortfall to bring people up to a certain level of living as well, and so there's this that there's this area, this safe zone where it's a safe and just space for humanity, where those two not competing but coexisting needs are dealt with, and that's the most sustainable way that we can organize our society. So what's to try and move on to actually, what can we do and what are the solutions? So Philip Boucher-Hayes wrote an article there recently, and I thought he summed it up really well, that the main thing is it's never too late to stop punching yourself in the head. So we just need to now, I think the first thing is not to be fatalistic. A popular hot take on climate change is that we can no longer do anything that will make a difference. We all have tools and strategies needed to arrest and eventually reverse this crisis. We just haven't properly accepted that it is a crisis and that it requires a COVID-19 level response. So we need to do something now. We are where we are, and we need to just grasp the nettle and get on with it as individuals, but most importantly as a society. And as a global society, we need to just get on and do it. And I suppose being fatalistic is going to be is possibly going to be one of the worst things that we can do. And then I think one of the most sustainable ways of thinking about what do as as a society, and then what older people can do, is the idea of an age-friendly built environment and an age-friendly society. So having things like walkable towns and villages that people live in, that access to public transport, enabling aging in place and in people's local communities, with things like exercise and recreation and health services, and resilient communities nearby, with social connectedness between intergenerational, but also civic participation, and that these are dementia friendly, that they're prepared for extreme climates, and that they're safe spaces and public spaces. That this idea of an age-friendly built environment is how we can organize our society, especially at a local level, to help address both climate change, but also the other social and societal needs that Kate Raworth mentioned as well, that we need to address. So then, specifically, things like housing and housing adaptation are essential, and I think we really need to, I think, as a society, focus on upgrading our housing stock. In Ireland, we have quite poor insulation traditionally in the bungalow bliss houses that were built in the 70s and 80s and so on. That we need to upgrade our housing stock, and that this can't just be left to the individual. Older persons are less likely to avail of current tax incentives and so on, and are often, obviously very dependent on things like fuel allowance and so on. That these need to be addressed, by government, through more focused either grants or through social welfare schemes. Or perhaps even something like a fair deal scheme for housing, to improve housing. But these housing adaptations are essential. They'll both help us in terms of through winter, improving our heating, but also to try and mitigate with cooling mechanisms during heat waves and so on. But they'll also help in the short term in terms of reducing indoor and outdoor air pollutants, especially if things like stoves and solid fuel burning is taken out of the equation. And then they'll also help address fuel poverty and and higher electricity bills and heating bills and so on. So to make our societies more resilient. So it is important, I think, that housing is one of the key focuses of any policies that are formulated. Food is the next piece that can be addressed, and I suppose huge amounts of our land is devoted to agriculture, but nearly half of our habitable land is devoted to agriculture, and of that, about 75–80% of that is devoted to livestock. For what is in proportion to plant-based food, relatively energy deficient, but if you look at it from a land use point of view, so down at the bottom you can see that about 18–20% of global protein or of global calories is from animals, and about a third of protein is from animals. Yes, we devote, as I said, 75–80% of agricultural land to animal rearing. So to give the space for forests, for biodiversity and so on, we need to change that to allow us to offset carbon emissions, but also to reduce our carbon emissions from livestock and so on. I'm not saying we need to stop eating meat, but we do, as I say, need to reduce it massively. And I suppose there's this idea of the planetary health plate, which balances both a healthy diet, you know, things like the Mediterranean diet, or you know, the DASH diet and so on. But that balances that with climate change as well. And so, you know, the idea that we should be eating more fruit and more vegetables, which is something we, you know, as health professionals we always say, and then having minimal amounts of animal source foods, you know, such as dairy and meat, and getting more of our protein from plants rather than from meat. And then also that we need to eat in moderation, and then waste not, want not. And this is coming from the Eat Lancet Commission, which in 2017. And this is what a picture of a day's worth of food could look like according to the Planetary Health Diet. So you can see quite small amount, still some meat, but still, you know, quite small amounts of meat and dairy and eggs and so on. But that, you know, most of your protein will come from nuts, from pulses, and so on. And that if, as a globe, if we did this, that it would be a far more sustainable diet for everyone, whilst still ensuring that adequate, you know, nutritional needs are met. The next thing that needs to be spoken about is flying, and I suppose if anyone, you know, anyone who has flown, or anyone who has been on a plane, is in one of the most privileged parts of the world, because most people have never even been on a plane, and so it is a disproportionate activity for richer parts of the world. And I suppose, what, you know, we're an island, I suppose, you know, we can't really avoid doing some flying. You know, certainly we need to think about, you know, where are we flying to, how often are we flying, and do we need to fly as well? And certainly in parts of the, you know, in say France, they've banned short haul flights, and that is, you know, something that I think as a globe that we need to think about, and think about how alternatives that we can do. So you know, the idea of, you know, sail and rail, or taking holidays at home to keep, you know, rather than always going abroad, is something that, you know, we need to think about, and that'll have benefits for domestic tourism as well, because in Ireland we spend more tourism money outside of Ireland than we do in Ireland, and so you know, this is an opportunity to help you know, put tourism in Ireland on a more sustainable platform as well. I think I skipped a slide there. So next thing is that we need to you know, think about how we design our cities and our towns. And you know, the LTNs has been a big controversy over in the UK, but you know, they're essentially what has been around for decades and decades, where housing estates don't have through traffic, and that you know, that people can walk between estates, and but you can't drive through. And you know, you walk around a lot of older estates around, you know, around Dublin and other towns. It's a very common, you know, it's fairly common, and you know, it's just expanding that, and not having loads of traffic driving past your house, which I think when it's sold like that is a far more less controversial thing to do. But active travel in and of itself is one of the biggest, I think, biggest things that we can do to improve our, you know, climate, and improve the emissions that we make, but also improve air pollution and physical activity in the short term. So it is something that would have, you know, great short-term benefits to society, as well as the longer-term climate action. And so this report from Lancet Countdown on health and climate change estimates that active travel globally it could save if we increase that it could save 1.6 million lives due to cleaner air, and then 2.1 million lives due to increased physical activity every year. So it is one of these, I think, one of the strongest co-benefits to taking climate action that can be done. And then there's just paper after paper that shows the benefits of active travel and active commuting over car driving and so on. So this study from the UK showed that cycling had reduced down your risk of all-cause mortality by 41% compared to either driving or taking public transport, if that was your main mode of commuting. So it can have huge benefits in terms of reducing down mortality, integrating active travel into your commute, as older people, even just into your day-to-day activities. So into going to the shops or going to going to activities and so on. Integrating into your day-to-day life will have big impacts on your mortality. This other study, again, study after study, prospective study of bicycling and risk of coronary heart disease in Danish men and women, again showed a benefit to cycling in terms of reducing then coronary heart disease. And then how does this happen? Well, it's not just about activity, but physical activity, in particular cycling, may protect actually against the immunological aging process and may improve, may actually help to slow down the progression and aging of people's bodies. And not just cycling or but also walking as well is important, and having walkable neighborhoods that people can that are more local and services are more local. This 15-minute city idea for adults aged 60 plus years, neighborhood walkability had a positive effect on ratings of health and satisfaction with neighborhood appearance, and higher levels of health and satisfaction with neighborhood appearance in turn were rated higher happiness in this age group. So people who live in more walkable neighborhoods are happier, they have more connections with their community, and have better health outcomes. And this is an Irish study led out from a team in TUD. And one of the things is often, I'm too old to take up cycling, or I'm too old to do these things. This is Marie Silk at this time she was 79, and it's her friend Mary Farrell over in Galway, and she had found that ordinary bikes weren't an option for her because of hip operations and so on. But she was also finding walking exhausting. So her son Richard got her this tricycle, and her friend too, and it transformed her. She was able to get out and cycle and get out to the shops and so on, and be more active in her society. And her son noted that seeing his mother on the bike brought joy not just to her but to the entire family. And she became involved in advocacy for better cycle lanes in Salt Hill. And here's a photo of her and her family on a protest in Salt Hill for cycle lanes. And she's an example of how older people can advocate for better facilities, and use their voice to enable things like active transport, not just for their I think children and grandchildren, but also for themselves, because having these things is better for older people as well, and having these not just other generations. And so things like, safe, well-lit footpaths, cycle paths, provision of visibility equipment, encourage and provide a safe environment for older people to use active transport, and also increases mobility and community engagement. So things like I think things like, Dublin bikes, bike sharing schemes, like they should be available on the free travel scheme. We should also be encouraging or giving grants, or having bike libraries and so on, to allow older people to trial things like trikes or cargo bikes, things like that, to help them get around. So we need, having maybe, through the local library, that you can hire a bike, or try things out. That these things need to be done. At the minute, the bike to work scheme is a great initiative, but it excludes people who are on social welfare or on state pension. But so these initiatives should be opened up, I think, to everyone, not just to people who are working, to enable people to be able to participate in active travel, because it has global benefits, not just for climate change, but for mortality, cardiovascular disease, and so on, and helps improve health outcomes as well as climate outcomes. Public transport is, I suppose, is something that older people especially really rely on, and it is, and with the free travel cards, that it is, a lot of older people rely on, but it needs to be a lot more accessible than it is at the minute. Things like, people in wheelchairs having to give 24 hours notice in advance to use the train or some bus services really shouldn't be the case in a society that's trying to tackle climate change, or or in any modern society, to enable people to engage in society properly. Universal accessibility is key to enable disabled people to access public transport options and reduce their carbon emissions. And so things like bus connects, or new darts that are coming out and so on, need to be fully accessible for people who have limited mobility or in wheelchairs. I do note that the new dart trains that are coming out are going to be fully accessible, but that needs to be rolled out across all the stock, because otherwise it stops people with disabilities engaging in society, and limits their ability to engage with improving climate change, and could lock people into especially if things like cars are limited, could lock people into either very expensive, or could exclude people from society. And then finally, healthcare. In healthcare itself, we need to look at our carbon footprint. In the NHS, they account for 4% of all UK emissions are related to the NHS, and it's pretty similar here in the HSE. And in the NHS, they have a green section that are focused on examining and addressing the NHS carbon footprint. In the HSE, there has been some attempts to do so, and there have been some reports made, but there's no focus, dedicated group within the HSE, and I think that is a huge gap that needs to be addressed. That within the HSE, we can't allow can't think that it's for some other sector to address. Every sector within society needs to address and go towards net zero, and healthcare is a key part that needs to do that. And so there needs to be a dedicated unit within the HSE to address climate change and get the HSE to net zero. Within the NHS, they have a plan. They have this pathway to net zero within their carbon footprint scope to get their emissions down through things like getting rid of nitrous oxide. There's some very basic things that could be done to extend out to changing your fleet and so on. But I suppose the thing here is there's a plan in the NHS. They're getting there. We need to do similar within the HSE. So I suppose to summarize, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? These are all things that will improve our lives anyway, even if it wasn't for climate change. And we just need, so it really is a no-brainer to do these things. And finally, on the older person and the older person's voice, I think it is such an important voice that has been missing, I suppose, from the climate change conversation. And I think it's often framed within the context of future generations and how this is going to affect future generations. But this is, I think, as I've tried to detail today, this is going, affecting us now, and it is going to affect older people disproportionately, more so than other parts of society. And so it is important that the older person's voice is there, and we might talk about that later. But I think it is important that their perspective is listened to and is taken into account. And Mary Robinson is obviously one of the biggest advocates worldwide for climate change, and it doesn't allow her the fact that she's older to get in that to impede that, and I think it is important that her voice, but other voices like hers are heard as well. And the a couple of weeks ago there, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in a landmark case that the human rights of older Swiss women was violated by Swiss inaction on climate. And so it was actually, there were two other cases that fell for younger people, but it was actually the case where these Swiss older women brought that the impacts of heat waves and so on them would have effects on their health, was the one that kind of stood up in court. And it just highlights how important it is that the older person's voice comes through, and that that it is such a strong voice to be heard. And so by ensuring the needs of older people are prioritised in climate change policy formation, older people can be climate change champions. So thank you very much. Just to finish, the climate crisis is a health crisis. That's, I suppose, the slogan of the Irish Doctors for the Environment, and just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrne. That was certainly a tour de force of learning about climate change, and Dr. Byrne is going to stay with us on the panel. So please, there's some questions in which we'll get to, so please continue to submit your questions. And I'm delighted to be joined by a very distinguished panel. So first, Dr. Sean Owens, who is a full-time GP in County Louth, who has an interest in lifestyle medicine, sustainable diets and planetary health. Originally from County Down, Sean studied at Queen's and is a member of the Irish Society of Lifestyle Medicine and Irish Doctors for the Environment. He also chairs the ICGP, which is an organisation for GPs, Sustainability and Planetary Health Working Group, who published a toolkit for making primary care more sustainable. So thank you very much, Sean, for joining us today. And then we have a colleague of mine locally, Professor Suzanne Timmins, who's a geriatrician and professor of geriatric medicine in UCC. And she is leading the Change Project, which is an alliance to develop kind of micro-credentials on climate mitigation and how we can adapt as healthcare workers across Europe, so that our health service and older people can be more climate resilient. And next we have Janice Morrissey, who's Director of Health Promotion, Information and Training at the Irish Heart Foundation, where she leads national services across all settings, communities, schools and healthcare sites, and also training for members of the public and healthcare professionals. She was also a founding member of the Climate and Health Alliance, which includes all healthcare professionals and advocacy groups on the island of Ireland. So thank you very much for joining us today, and you're very welcome. And first, I think maybe it's just speaking to your last point there, Colm, about advocacy and how, and I might address this to everybody in the panel, that how older adults can better advocate kind of for the climate, and how do we mobilise kind of that huge cohort that could champion this. So maybe to you first, Janice, you've done a lot of work in the advocacy area.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Think the I think for me, this was probably three things. Number one, to educate, because I think, you know, a lot of the discourse has been around younger people and activation there, and older people have been forgotten, as, you know, lots of life experience, and that intergenerational impact I think is really important to recognise too. So, and I think education doesn't have to be glitzy campaigns. You know, it's about talking, it's about storytelling. And, you know, we think of, you know, recent kind of social change referendums and how storytelling was so important there. So, you know, I think it's kind of connecting. Climate can seem so abstract, and I think it's connecting it to the reality and our lived experience right now, and drawing on maybe older people's experience over the course of their lives is really, really important. Outside of education, I think collaboration and maybe at multidisciplinary teams at a healthcare level, or be a collaboration at a community level, I think is really important. That connection together and joining of those dots around climate action. And that brings me to my third point, is around advocacy. And again, that doesn't have to be, you know, outside Leinster House at a placard. That can be at a local level as well, advocating in your local community, advocating in your workplace. And it can obviously also importantly be being an active citizen. You know, we've local elections, we've European elections, potentially a general election. So, you know, there's an opportunity to influence policy development through your voice as a citizen as well.
Thank you very much, Janice. And Suzanne, would you like to talk about?
Yeah, so actually just in relation, to older people as activists, I suppose we must remember our age-friendly county programme. So every county in Ireland has an ageing older persons council, you know, who have a really strong link to the council, but also, you know, they're very a voice that can be heard. And also, you know, there's groups like, for example, Elders for Earth is a specific group of older people who are climate activists, because we must remember that older people also suffer from climate anxiety, and so mental resilience is really important. So it is useful for all healthcare workers, I think, to be able to show older people how they can reduce the negative impact on the climate, but also how they can show people the skills that they actually grew up with, of, you know, things like, you know, we talk about reduce, reuse, recycle. That's what older people did all their lives. So actually they have a lot of skills that they can share with people. So I think it's mainly for us to put them in contact with local groups in the community and nationally, where they can take part in the solution.
Sorry, and Sean, sorry. There was actually an airplane going over my office causing noise, so that's why I went on mute as we're talking about this. But Sean, sorry.
I know. I mean, I think it made me think of something there, Janice, about this concept of storytelling. I recall in 2021, I think we went to COP26, a delegation from Irish Doctors for the Environment. And it was really jarring that inside the conference halls, with all of the fancy lanyards, which is where all of the delegates and the politicians and media were making decisions on all of our futures. And outside were stakeholders that were completely excluded, including ourselves. We didn't get the lanyards. Were children, school children, marching. And the other group were Indigenous communities who've been completely disenfranchised. And the climate crisis is all too real for not just island nations, but Indigenous populations, whether it be Australia or the tundra. And they were there to say, well, you know, not only are we being forcibly removed by nature, not only is this not a just issue, we have knowledge that you know how you live in harmony with your natural world, and I think it's very humbling that we don't ask for their advice. And the technology of Indigenous populations is actually what Janice talked about, storytelling. And that's something we're really doing very poorly at the minute with social media. And I'm always think that this idea of bringing digitalization to older people is a double-edged sword, because I think it comes with it isolation. Comes with it a distortion of one-to-one storytelling or community-based storytelling, and I'm sort of not quite sure about it. So storytelling, community resilience, and shared values, these are the technologies of Indigenous people I think we're going to need going forward. So all of our climate action plans are about seawalls and about biofuels. But the one thing we don't talk about enough is community resilience. And to answer your question, Emer, a focal voice in any community is our elders. So I think they have a huge role to play in informing us about these often forgot about technologies, such as storytelling and so forth.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, just about the digitization there. And I might stay with you, Sean, actually, because Dermot has put in a question. And I think that oftentimes people find that maybe not so facialistic, but that it seems futuristic, that your own kind of contribution to climate change and that. And Dermot put in kind of like that he's doing all he can. And I suppose just from your kind of like your own kind of personal and professional kind of experience, Sean, what can people kind of personally do that will kind of affect climate change, but also improve their health, as Colm talked about, so something that's more tangible to your day-to-day, as opposed to, not going on the flight once a year, I think that people can connect to.
I answered Dermot's query there and said, well, it might seem quite small to change your personal actions, but there's a ripple effect at a community level. I mean, there's a lot we need to do at the level of policymakers. And I think as healthcare professionals on the call, we are amongst the most trusted in society. A real sign of the times that the various Ipsos polls usually routinely rate politicians and the media as the least trusted in society. So that's not good. That's not good. I wish it wasn't the case. So we have patient contacts. I'm talking about healthcare professionals. We have a trusted role in society. We meet people at their teachable moments, and that's when we can advocate for the big ones that Colm outlined, which is active transport, which is plant-based diets, which is a reduction in burning of smoky fuels. So I really wouldn't be involved in climate action at all if it was that part of it was controversial. From a healthcare point of view, these are penalty kicks. There's really no safer bet in terms of evidence-based health decisions than to eat more fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, greens. There's no safer bet that I know of in terms of grade 1 level A evidence than to get moderate to vigorous exercise routinely. But I suppose what Colm's talking about there and what Paris have done is they've engineered this into people's daily lives. I think what we really need to do next is to engineer healthy and sustainable diets into people's lives, rather than the shame, blame, stigma cycle where we allow a toxic food environment and then blame people for not being healthy. That's really a systems issue, Emer.
Thank you very much, Sean. And there's been another question in from Smith, just talking about vulnerable older adults, for example, those in nursing homes. So, how are they kind of, I suppose, Suzanne, if you could just talk maybe about that cohort and what kind of those individuals can do, and also the organizations in which they're living, how they can prepare kind of for climate change.
So I'm glad that we've come to this, and obviously climate mitigation, trying to reduce future problems is core, but actually healthcare also at the same time needs to think about climate adaptation and resilience, which is accepting that the climate is going to be different. We are going to have more and more severe weather events, flooding, storms, heat waves, where we older people will have health problems, but also the healthcare system will be challenged to provide care. So where we cannot get out to the vulnerable older person who lives on their own, where the patients in, say, residents in a nursing home or people in a hospital may become extremely hot You know, so even in my own hospital, I often see in the summer, you know, people who are next to the windows. They're lovely big windows, they're a great idea, but actually the people are overheated. And I spend a lot of time putting curtains and giving people glasses of water. So we need to think about this, you know, we need to think about our environment when it's going to be incredibly hot, when it's going to, we can't get out to people in their homes. And so I do want to introduce the Change Project, where we are developing micro-credentials for healthcare professionals and healthcare workers in climate adaptation. So in risk assessing where you work and the clients you work with in terms of their particular vulnerabilities. So it might be a home care worker who has to go out to 10 people on a given day. If you cannot get out, what will happen to those people? Who's going to give them water during a heat wave? Who's going to check their sugars if you were the person who should be doing that? And then in terms of, say, our maintenance and, you know, kind of engineers, are we designing our future buildings for the kind of climate that we're going to live in? So, you know, I think we have to think about, as I've said, adaptation hand in hand with mitigation. And as healthcare workers, we have spoken about the particular voice we have. People trust us, people listen to us. And so now is a time for us all to take a role in thinking in 10 years' time, what is the challenge I'm going to face in healthcare and how will I get to that vulnerable older person? And again, thinking of in nursing homes, particularly as the question was, I think it's thinking about flooding events, fires, and really prolonged spells of intense heat. Are those buildings future-proofed for that?
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And Colm, there's been a few questions in and you alluded to in your talk about kind of age-friendly design and kind of fair deal housing. I was wondering, could you just say a little bit more about kind of age-friendly design and, you know, how that contributes to climate and I suppose kind of like for the generations?
Yeah, I suppose so. You know, the key thing about age-friendly design is keeping people in their own homes or keeping them in their own communities where they have already got the networks, the resilience, you know, to, as you know, both help with, you know, live in, you know, a more local way, but also, as Suzanne said, you know, to adapt as well, you know, to that they have communities so they know their neighbour, that if, you know, there's a drought they can knock over, you know, and someone will help them get water and so on. So it's about living, being able to live within your community that you know. And then having, you know, so to do that, your community needs to be set up to you know, across the age group. So, you know, and it's things, you know, it's even small things like, you know, that you know, your main street is, you know, pedestrian friendly. There's seats, you know, there's trees, you know, to help cool down the streets through summer, and to maybe help mitigate with some, you know, some flooding and things like that. So it's about how it's difficult because you know, I see some of the questions coming through. A lot of these things are societal you know, things, and I suppose Mary Robinson, you know, answers that, you know, the question of what can individuals do. It's pick out some actions, you know, some individual actions, like, you know, say cycling to the shops instead of you know, instead of driving, or you know, eating more plant-based diet, like Sean mentioned. But that, you know, the key thing that she says is advocacy, and advocating, you know, on the local level, on, you know, with people, you know, and with policymakers, you know, so you know, on the doorsteps, or, you know, local elections are coming up now soon. That's, you know, and European elections. That's a great opportunity to talk to people about, you know, talk to politicians and bring it forward. And so it's, yeah, but it's about age attuning, but, you know, a key part is, you know, is age attuning, or local areas, because, you know, the building decisions, you know, they last with us for, you know, for decades, you know. So again, the decisions we make today are going to affect how we age into the future. And I think it is, you know, it is so important that we bear that in mind when, you know, when we are doing these things. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks a million, Colm. And Janice, I just wanted to ask you, you know, about the connection between kind of what you can do for climate change plus kind of like your own health promotion to preventing you getting sick, or, you know, and the connection really with that about the climate change, how it can improve your health kind of today, tomorrow, you know, in terms of like the connection between that.
Absolutely. I think as Colm set out, there's you know, what's good for your health is good for the planet, and there's so many win-wins, you know, be it around you know, a more plant-based diet, or around a more active lifestyle, or around, you know, better insulated houses, or improved air quality in a community. They all have that dual you know, benefit, and that's really the cornerstone of why the Climate and Health Alliance was established, was to collectively come together as healthcare professionals to shine a spotlight on, you know, the interplay there, that, you know, health is often the forgotten voice in the climate conversation and discourse. So, and I think it's really important, the points coming out as well around the need for system change, that a lot of the you know, the messaging, you know, from policymakers has been around individual action, and yes, that's important, but ultimately we do need kind of that brave political decision making, and we as citizens need to support that brave political decision making as well around, you know, change is hard, and we all are used to a certain way of life, but we need to be, you know, supported in that policy change, and recognizing those, you know, we all know we should eat 5 to 7 fruit and veg a day for our health and for the planet, but ultimately there are so many factors, you know, at play in terms of the, you know, all the ultra processed food that's marketed, the pricing structures, the availability, and all of those, you know, factors need to be tackled at a policy level. We as individual citizens have very limited agency. So, you know, while there's huge overlap between the benefits of policies to improve health and climate, ultimately a lot of them are down to you know, to government action. So it is really kind of back to advocacy and calling for changes at a local community level as much as at a national level as well.
Thanks, Janice. And I think, you know, a lot of kind of like even reading through the questions there, you know, there is, and I know from my own mother, myself, she would talk about the climate change and her worry. So there is an element of anxiety there, particularly around older people for their grandchildren, you know, and I think it's clear kind of from everybody speaking today that we're talking about that every little bit helps, and it's about kind of that kind of aggregation of all those efforts that can make, but is that anxiety, like, is, you know, how do we kind of balance that, I suppose, the kind of encouraging the advocacy and people to do things, but obviously there is an anxiety as well, which can also have a detrimental effect. Maybe Suzanne, could you?
Yeah, so I think we have to look at what makes people anxious. It's usually kind of a feeling of lack of control and not knowing what to do. So I think when we give people practical solutions straight away, that reduces anxiety. So I think it's important we move away from any blame of older people, because sometimes you get the feeling that there is that feeling that people think, well, it's the way you lived your lives has now the planet in the way it is now. So we need to be blameless, and we need to think of, for older people, giving them practical solutions we've talked about in their day-to-day lives, you know, making sure that people are hooked into local networks where they can make a difference. And again, I would really, you know, say the age-friendly community and age-friendly county kind of process is a very good place for anyone to start. You know, but it's local advocacy, as we've said, people knowing that it does make a difference. You know, if a few people go to a local supermarket and say, we don't want huge big packets of things, we want less packaging, you know, that makes a difference. It doesn't take that many people to say the same thing for shops to start to change things. So for me, it would be giving people practical things that they can do, and local people that they can meet with, and straight away, the minute you feel you're doing something to solve the problem, I think anxiety levels then automatically reduce. And again, to remind people that we talked about the co-benefits of cycling and walking, nature, getting out in nature automatically will reduce your anxiety levels. So by people getting out more outside of cars, you know, walking, cycling, and being out in nature, it also automatically will reduce their stress levels.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And there's a question in there from Mark Matthews talking about, do you have any, I'll send this to Colm and Sean, maybe, do you have any concerns about older people cycling to the shops? You know, in terms of accidents or whatever, and dangers around from the cycle lanes. And somebody else, when I talked about actually about this talk today. They were talking about some of the cycle lanes and the way they're built and designed, that there's not very much visibility. So when you're walking across the road, you're actually falling over the things sticking up on the road for the cycle lane. So I'll give that one over to you, Colm, there to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of I suppose poor quality cycle lanes that have been built, and I think things are getting better with new cycling manual, but it is things like red tarmac and so on can help improve the design and help with visibility. It's simple things like that, contrast and so on, to improve visibility can make a big difference. But in terms of, am I worried about older people cycling? I'm more worried about them not cycling, not being active, not getting out. Like that. I think we all are. Like, exercise is the best thing older people can do to help their health. And I'm more worried about them being in the car, and also if they have hearing issues or balance, hearing issues and vision issues and so on. Driving isn't going to be safe for them as well. So how are they going to get around, in their locality then? Are they, they're going to be stuck in their homes, or they're going to be relying on people to give them lifts and so on. So, like, we need to enable people to get out. And, you go to the Netherlands and you see a lot more older people. In fact, the biggest, the age group that proportionally cycles most is 65 to 74-year-olds in the Netherlands. It's that age group that proportionally cycle most, because it is, they mightn't be able to drive as much, or they might be able to afford to drive, but they can get on a bike and get around. And I think it is, if this is built up, if it is something that people do, and build up at, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, it's something that can continue on into people's 80s and 90s. But if it's a habit that they haven't done, it can be harder to do. But it's still possible that, like Mrs. Silk that I highlighted in Galway, there are things that can be adapted, there are trikes and so on that can be used to enable people to get around. If the cycle, if the environment is safer, if speed limits are lower, if the cycle lanes are of sufficient size and sufficient quality, you can enable people to get around. But it's about how, what's the alternative? Otherwise people are stuck in their homes and are isolated, and we don't want that. We want to get people, people out and involved in society. And
Yeah, thanks very much. And Sean, could you just talk maybe just about kind of like exercise in older people and kind of that kind of lifestyle and the benefits, and is there risks, if any?
I suppose I'd love Emer to just unpack the question, because it's very interesting. As Colm said, there's a lost opportunity when you drive. Cars take up a disproportionate amount of the road, and conversely, an older person cycling down to the shops frees up a huge amount of road space. But it made me think of a study last year by Professor Peter Lunn from the ESRI, when he's a behaviour change expert. And that's the big commonality with climate change and healthcare provision, is we're trying to affect behaviour change. And he looks at something called a status quo bias. He got 400 participants to read 2 short paragraphs about a town, a Midland town that has a library, a pub, a main street, and it's got excellent cycle lanes, and it's got special places where people with disabilities can park, and it's well lit, and there's trees lining the streets. And then they ask a separate group to read the same thing, only the trees are planned, the cycle lane is planned. They're going to put in disability parking bays, and they asked these randomized groups to rate their approval. And people didn't approve of the planned ones, but they were very accepting of the one where it was already established. And that is to say that we perceive problems. So if you go to somewhere like the Netherlands or Paris now, you will see elderly people cycling around without an issue. Now, They've engineered it that it's safe, it's practical, they've supported people buying bikes and moving away from their cars, and they've taxed the SUVs, of course. So there's been some policies that have enabled that. But there's no, that wouldn't be a question that's raised there because it's already happened. So we perceive risks and we negate, at the other end of the spectrum, inside a generation, most children are left to the school gate in a car. So there was no risk there. We've kind of imagined it, as it were. So I just think that there's perceived risks that don't take into account the opportunities lost with cycling.
Very good.
I'll put the paper.
And just from the health promotion side, Janice, is there anything just you'd like to add to that in terms of like kind of exercise and I suppose throughout the lifespan, but I suppose for
Absolutely.
people,
Yeah, and I suppose we see, the national data demonstrates there's a huge, fall in the levels of physical activity as people age. So, it's to normalize an active lifestyle, that like activity is not something for children and young people and young adults. It's it's really important across the life course. So I think being facilitating older people to be out cycling and normalizing that within the local community, I think is a really important part of this as well. And that's advocacy, like that's demonstrating leadership in your local community. It's advocating with your local politicians around having access to safe walking. It's not all about cycling, even just like safe walking routes as well. But I think there's been so many nice examples, particularly in the COVID times, where there were pathways that were built out, or temporary cycle lanes, and they've been used. So there is a case of build it and they will come, and it's about supporting politicians to make those changes. And there may be vocal minorities against those changes, but we need to kind of step up and support politicians to make those permanent changes for the betterment of all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's kind of really clear today from the discussion, I suppose, and even thank you very much, Sean. You're responding to questions there in the chat. I'm never able to multitask and do those things at the same time. So thank you very much. That it really kind of seems, and what's coming out even from Bridette there is, the communities in which we live, and I suppose in how they're designed, seems to really be one of those kind of like critical things for climate, for health, for storytelling, like you were talking about earlier on. So, it's a bit like what you're kind of one of your last slides there, Colm, like that it's a bit of an own goal, kind of like climate change is actually, there's so much other benefits kind of when you're advocating for that. And there is something about maybe kind of like having that kind of broader kind of societal kind of like conversation around it, and again, is there, I suppose kind of in terms of kind of like just closing up or whatever, we've talked a lot about the advocacy, and I know, Suzanne, you mentioned, and maybe I'll mention it again, and we will circulate to the audience just, advocacy groups, but, in each of the local authorities, so each in council that is around Ireland, every council has an older person's council through Age Friendly Ireland. And certainly that's a good kind of forum in which to kind of influence kind of things that happen across kind of then the world, kind of the county or the city in which you live in terms of like housing, transport, climate, healthcare and access and everything like that. So through Age Friendly Ireland, there is those councils. So we will give the links to those and how to contact them. But again, it's maybe just to kind of close up today again with just some key messages to kind of the older adults who've been listening in and the people who work with them every day, just in terms of a key message from today, kind of going out to the audience in terms of what you can do, kind of, I suppose, at that wider societal level, including the climate. Maybe that's kind of a big brief, but anyway, I'll start kind of like with Colm, since you started us off today.
So I think I think Mary Robinson's message is is a great message. So there are I saw some people say how I think it was Valerie about how her son's doing a lot and she maybe feels that she's not doing enough or something like that. I think there's only so much that we can do, and so you pick small things like maybe changing your diet, eating more fruit and veg, and being a bit more active, and replacing car journeys and so on, and do those small changes. But then so many of these things are fundamental societal things that that our society is designed to encourage us to eat fast food, to drive and so on, and that these things need to change at a society, at a societal level. And so I actually would encourage that there are local and European elections coming up, and I think it's something that to bring up at the doorstep, and about how as I kind of alluded to during the talk, how we can have co-benefits to improve climate change, but also improve where we live, and ultimately age better within more climate-friendly societies.
Thank you very much. Or maybe I've gone to you last when you're finishing with Mary Robinson, but anyway, that's good. So Sean?
I mean, obviously I read and listen to a lot of sort of climate, biodiversity content, and I find that almost a universal sign off in terms of advice, whether it's to do with fossil fuels or active transport or aviation or plastics, is for the future shocks that we have engineered in and that we'll all live through, is to build your own community resilience. And I've been amazed by how often thought leaders from around the world say the same thing, and that is endorse your own local community. So whether it's your neighbor, whether it's a climate cafe, whether it's taking your kids to GAA, doing a litter pickup, and if you want to be really more constructive, when someone knocks on your door, ask for active travel and infrastructure to be enacted. Find out who your local farmer is for a veg box, and support those smaller actions, because I think how Ireland copes with the climate crisis that we're living through and to come will really be determined by community resilience. And I think that's something we can all work towards. As woolly as that sounds, I think that's, for me, what I think about and what I spend time doing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Sean. And Janice?
I think for me, it's vote, and encourage everyone around you to vote as well. We're very fortunate to live in a democracy and have a franchise to exercise, so get out and vote.
And Suzanne?
I think I'd echo what everyone has said, that community resilience. We think of, remember Neighbourhood Watch, where people would keep an eye on each other's houses. We can have that same approach for, who are the vulnerable people in your local community and how might they be affected, and, work together. So if you think of Men's Sheds, the ICA, the GAA, a lot of us are already members of really good support networks. So, maybe at your next meeting, you have a climate focus meeting, because it may not be something that you've linked. So I think, go through your local community, any group you're a member of, bring climate into some of those conversations, and then it's not just you, suddenly it's 10 or 20 people magnifying the effect.
Great, thank you very much. And I would like to thank all our panelists today. It's been a really thought-provoking lecture. And to answer some of the questions, we will have this recording available after it finishes up today, and Declan, we will circulate out to the older persons councils, and if there's any questions in relation to this, please get in contact with us and we'll be able to finish it. I'm not very good at Irish, but I know there's a saying, well, I'll just say it in English, that we live in each other's shadows, and I think a lot of what we're talking about today is kind of like bringing back that sense of community again, and all the really good things that as Irish people that we're very good at, the looking after each other, kind of telling stories, and how we can use that actually to kind of influence our futures. And it's just making me think that it's leading me into our next public lecture, that I think we need to do something on kind of the talk about maybe the design of communities and what that would look like kind of going forward. So thank you very much to everyone for listening in today. Thank you to all our expert panels for contributing. I must say I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. So thank you very much.